9 seconds. That was all it took for one of the most seasoned political figures in Washington to stand behind a podium on live television with no polished comeback, no practiced smile, no carefully packaged, let me be clear, just Nancy Pelosi staring forward after Donald Trump reduced decades of political armor to a handful of dates, stock trades, disclosure filings, and one brutally simple demand: explain the math. In the framing of this confrontation, this was not supposed to be another shouting match where both sides threw accusations until the audience forgot what the original question was, because Trump arrived carrying something far more dangerous than another insult: a thin manila folder, a black Sharpie, and a sequence of numbers that the script presented as the financial trail Pelosi had never wanted placed side by side under television lights. Pelosi entered with the confidence of someone who had spent nearly 4 decades surviving presidents, party revolts, impeachment battles, congressional warfare, hostile interviews, and every kind of political ambush Washington could manufacture. But confidence looks different when the argument stops being ideological and starts becoming arithmetic. The entire premise was savage in its simplicity. Forget the speeches, forget the partisan slogans, forget the reputations, put the dates on paper, draw the arrows, and force the person standing across the stage to answer what those dates supposedly meant. The setting was a CNN primetime debate centered on stock trading and public trust, moderated by Jake Tapper, with 2 podiums, 2 enormous political reputations, and an atmosphere designed for confrontation rather than ceremony. Pelosi opened exactly as the script expected her to open, with controlled condescension, reminding viewers of her 37 years of service, her 2 terms as Speaker of the House, the legislation she had helped pass, and Trump's felony convictions, delivering every line with the polished ease of someone who had survived thousands of cameras without letting the camera see panic. Trump did not answer with a philosophical defense, a policy lecture, or an attempt to out-speech her. Instead, he uncapped the Sharpie, wrote a date on the paper, circled it, and turned the entire discussion toward Nvidia. November became the first marker tied in the script to Paul Pelosi's purchase of 50 Nvidia call options, a transaction described as worth between $1 and $5 million and structured around a long-term position in a company sitting directly inside one of Washington's biggest legislative battles. Then came the second half of the comparison: the CHIPS and Science Act, roughly $52 billion in semiconductor subsidies, legislation Pelosi had strongly supported and publicly promoted, now placed beside the Nvidia transaction so the audience could see the connection the script wanted them to question. That was the first pressure point, because the argument was not that investing in Nvidia was automatically illegal, nor that supporting semiconductor legislation automatically proved misconduct, but that the timing looked politically radioactive once the transaction and the legislative calendar were placed on the same page. Trump's attack sharpened around the claim that Paul Pelosi made roughly $4.5 million within 6 months, turning what could have been discussed as an ordinary successful investment into something framed as a question about privileged information and proximity to power. Pelosi answered with the defense she had used before. Her husband had invested professionally for decades. His investment decisions were his own. She did not personally own stocks, and she had no knowledge of his individual transactions. Trump immediately rejected the idea that denial settled the issue, drawing a distinction between something being disproven and something simply being denied, because his strategy depended on keeping the burden of explanation on Pelosi rather than allowing her to bury the question under a familiar disclaimer. And before she could convert the debate into another ideological argument about Republicans, Democrats, capitalism, or congressional procedure, he moved to the next date. July 1st, 2024 became the second marker, presented as the date Paul Pelosi sold 2,000 shares of Visa stock in a transaction valued between $500,000 and $1 million. Trump then wrote September 24th, 2024 beneath it, identifying that as the date the Department of Justice filed an antitrust lawsuit against Visa, after which the company's stock dropped, creating another timeline the script framed as suspicious because the sale had occurred roughly 11 weeks earlier. One exit can be dismissed as ordinary timing, two can be treated as coincidence. But Trump's presentation was built to make repetition itself become the accusation. So he did not linger long enough for Pelosi to dismantle one example before placing another one beside it. December 2022 came next, tied to Paul Pelosi's sale of 30,000 Google shares, followed by the claim that the Department of Justice sued Google roughly 1 month later in an antitrust action. 3 sets of dates, 3 arrows, 3 transactions positioned before major government actions, and suddenly the argument was no longer being presented as a single lucky investment, but as a pattern demanding an explanation. That was where the room, as described in the script, changed because repetition gives numbers a psychological weight that speeches rarely achieve, and Trump understood exactly how to exploit that effect without needing to increase his volume. Instead of saying Pelosi was guilty and moving on, he kept returning to the dates, forcing the audience to stare at the sequence and arrive at the suspicion themselves, while tappers stopped pen and the shifting camera angle became visual signals that the confrontation had moved beyond normal partisan theater. Trump then escalated beyond the public filings, claiming that a former Pelosi staff member had told House investigators under oath that legislative calendars, committee schedules, voting timelines, and regulatory actions were discussed around the Pelosi dinner table. The script does not independently establish that allegation, but inside the confrontation, it served a specific purpose: to transform the argument from mere statistical timing into a claim that information moving through Pelosi's political office could potentially have crossed into the family's private financial world. Pelosi's posture tightened, but Trump immediately returned to the safer terrain of what the script described as publicly observable behavior, because the most effective attack was not the allegation nobody could verify on the stage, but the trading record millions of viewers could search after the broadcast. That brought him to Pelosi Tracker, Unusual Whales, Quiver Quantitative, and the wider ecosystem of platforms built around monitoring congressional trades, tools that existed because public suspicion had become strong enough to create an audience for watching lawmakers' portfolios almost in real time. Trump weaponized that phenomenon with deliberate mockery, arguing that ordinary Americans had become so fascinated by Paul Pelosi's investing performance that people were building products specifically to imitate or analyze those trades, turning congressional disclosure forms into something resembling a market signal. The script then introduced a statistical claim placing the odds of 3 perfectly timed exits before major DOJ actions at roughly 1 in 4,000. Not proof of wrongdoing, but a number deployed for maximum political damage, because improbable patterns are much harder to dismiss emotionally than isolated anecdotes. Trump uncapped the Sharpie again and reduced the broader attack to 2 numbers written beside each other: a congressional salary of $223,500 and a family net worth the script repeatedly described as approximately $250 million. That contrast became the center of the entire first act, because his question was no longer simply whether one trade was fortunate or whether one disclosure was properly filed, but how decades of public service and private investing had produced a fortune so enormous that the salary itself looked almost irrelevant. He calculated roughly $8.2 million in congressional salary across 37 years before taxes, and then pointed again to the $250 million figure, presenting the gap as something that demanded more than Pelosi's standard explanation that her husband was simply very good at investing. Pelosi reached for the water, kept her movements controlled, and defended Paul Pelosi's decisions as independent private market activity, even turning the argument back on Republicans by invoking their traditional support for free markets. Trump's reply was designed to cut through that defense by separating participation in the market from proximity to the people who write the rules governing that market, arguing that the real concern was not investment itself, but whether lawmakers or their families could benefit from information ordinary investors could not possibly possess at the same moment. He then introduced what the script described as a summary from a House oversight investigation, claiming Pelosi's office calendar contained a notation concerning the chip's timeline roughly 2 weeks before the Nvidia purchase, another detail intended to pull the legislative schedule and the investment decision closer together. By this point, the confrontation had stopped looking like Pelosi's opening lecture on Trump's record and had become something much narrower, uglier, and potentially more damaging. A relentless demand that she explain why the dates appeared to line up so conveniently. Trump then attacked the political history surrounding congressional stock trading restrictions, accusing Pelosi of resisting bans for years while defending lawmakers' ability to participate in the market, only to support restrictions later when public scrutiny of congressional trading became impossible to ignore. The accusation was vicious because it framed the change not as reform but as self-preservation, suggesting that the vault had already been filled before the door was finally locked, a line of argument designed to make even a later endorsement of reform look compromised. Pelosi reached for the water again, but Trump was already moving away from the stock section, because the script's structure did not allow her the luxury of settling one controversy before the next arrived. He closed that section of the folder, opened another tab, and shifted from market disclosures and legislative calendars toward something more personal, more visual, and easier for millions of Americans to remember without understanding a single options contract. The next date was September 2020, when the country was still living under COVID restrictions. Small businesses were bleeding, salons in San Francisco were closed, and Nancy Pelosi was about to become the central figure in one of the most damaging photographs of her pandemic-era public image. September 2020 was where Trump shifted the attack from financial timing to something far more visceral because Americans did not need to understand derivatives, disclosure windows, committee calendars, or antitrust enforcement to understand one simple image. Businesses were closed. Ordinary people were being told to obey restrictions. And Nancy Pelosi was shown inside a San Francisco salon that had been shut down under those same restrictions. He reminded the audience that small businesses were collapsing. Families were separated from elderly relatives. Funerals were restricted. Restaurants were fighting to survive. And salons across San Francisco had been unable to operate normally for months. Then he placed Pelosi directly inside that landscape and asked why the rules seemed to apply differently once the Speaker of the House wanted her hair done. The security camera image, already notorious in the script's framing, became devastating, not because getting a blowout was some great national crime, but because Pelosi had supported a political environment built around sacrifice, compliance, and collective responsibility while appearing to grant herself an exception that ordinary business owners could not simply grant themselves. Trump even used humor to lower the temperature for a moment, joking about caring about his own hair, but the joke was only a bridge before the sharper point landed. If the rules were serious enough to close someone else's livelihood, they were serious enough for the politician defending those rules to follow them too. And when Pelosi responded to the controversy by saying the situation had been a setup and that the salon owed her an apology, Trump treated those words as the real scandal, because instead of centering the business owner who had been trapped inside months of restrictions, the response placed Pelosi's embarrassment at the center of the story. He flattened the printed security camera image on the podium and turned the salon owner into the face of the argument, describing Erica Cuse as a small business owner and mother whose livelihood had already been under enormous pressure before the incident exploded across national media. According to the script, after the footage became public and Pelosi accused the establishment of setting her up, Cuse received threats, eventually closed the salon, relocated her family, and saw years of work collapse under a controversy that had begun because she exposed a powerful official apparently operating under conditions ordinary customers were not supposed to enjoy. Trump's attack was mercilessly narrow. Pelosi had told the public that compliance mattered. Then, when she was caught inside a closed salon without the kind of conduct her own public posture suggested, she did not begin with an apology to the owner, but with an accusation that she had been wronged. Pelosi attempted to answer that she had taken responsibility and had been misled by the establishment. But Trump immediately returned to her original wording because it was a setup and the salon owes me an apology did not sound like responsibility in the framework he was building. The larger accusation was already clear. Pelosi had spent decades mastering the language of public duty, but when the burden of those rules touched her personally, the instinct presented in the script was not humility, but entitlement. From there, Trump widened the lens and made the contrast uglier, dragging Pelosi's wealth directly into the lockdown story by invoking her Pacific Heights home, expensive refrigerators, premium ice cream, and the spectacle of a political leader speaking about sacrifice from surroundings completely insulated from the kind of economic pain ripping through ordinary households. The point was not that wealthy politicians were forbidden from owning expensive appliances or eating expensive food, but that optics become political evidence when the public is losing jobs, waiting for relief checks, watching businesses disappear, and hearing lectures about discipline from people whose own standard of living is untouched by the crisis. He described a country told to stay home, mask up, close shops, skip appointments, and absorb the damage because the rules supposedly protected everyone, then placed Pelosi's salon visit beside that demand as the purest possible symbol of a governing class asking for sacrifices it did not appear equally willing to make. Rules for thee, but not for me, became the summary line, not offered as a clever slogan, but as an accusation that this single incident fit a much larger pattern running through the entire debate. Trump was no longer discussing one salon visit. He was arguing that the salon, the stock trades, the congressional power, and the family fortune all pointed toward the same governing instinct, one in which access, status, and connections seemed to soften consequences that remained brutally real for everyone outside the gates. Then came San Francisco, and the attack shifted again from a single incident to 37 years of representation because Pelosi's political career was inseparable from a city that Trump presented as a living audit of what long-term power had actually produced. He emphasized the sheer length of her tenure, noting that she had represented San Francisco since 1987, back when Ronald Reagan was still president, turning the calendar itself into an indictment because nearly 4 decades is more than enough time to claim credit when things improve, and more than enough time to face responsibility when they deteriorate. Trump produced public data in the script describing declining perceptions of safety, rising homelessness since 2017, record overdose deaths driven heavily by fentanyl, major retailers shutting locations, downtown office vacancies above 30%, and a district attorney recalled by voters after public frustration with crime and disorder. He laid those indicators beside Pelosi's political longevity and asked the question designed to strip away every possible excuse. After 37 years, how long can a representative continue blaming mayors, governors, district attorneys, state legislators, national trends, or anyone else for conditions inside the city tied so closely to her own public identity? The framing was savage because it turned experience, normally Pelosi's strongest credential, into the very thing used against her, converting 37 years of service from an achievement into a timestamp attached to every unresolved problem. Trump then returned to property and wealth, listing Pelosi's Pacific Heights mansion, the Napa Valley vineyard, the Washington waterfront condo, and Paul Pelosi's commercial real estate holdings, placing those assets beside the misery he described on San Francisco's streets. The contrast was deliberately brutal. Gated security, bay views, wine country, waterfront property, and a family fortune on one side, while homelessness, fentanyl, shuttered storefronts, break-ins, and fear occupied the other side, only blocks away from the political figure who had represented the city for generations. He described people living in tents and using drugs in public near some of the most expensive residential real estate in America, then asked how a leader could accumulate influence, seniority, federal funding, and personal wealth over decades while the fundamental conditions outside continued moving in the wrong direction. The script's accusation was not subtle and was never intended to be. Pelosi had climbed higher and higher within Washington, while too many people inside the district that sent her there watched their neighborhoods decline, their businesses struggle, and their sense of safety erode. That contrast allowed Trump to move from statistics toward the human example the script had prepared, a hardware store owner whose story was designed to make every percentage on the page suddenly feel like a receipt from somebody's real life. He introduced David Chen, described in the source as a longtime hardware store owner in Pelosi's district, a man whose father had opened the business and who had spent roughly 25 years serving the community before repeated break-ins finally destroyed what decades of work had built. Trump read from the letter presented in the script. 3 break-ins in 6 months, no arrests, police unable to provide the outcome he needed, prosecutors unwilling or unable to give him confidence, insurance dropping him after the second break-in, repair costs becoming impossible after the third, and finally, the closing of the store. Chen had voted for Pelosi in every election for 25 years, which made the story politically poisonous because Trump was not presenting him as an ideological enemy, a conservative activist, or someone waiting for an excuse to attack Democrats. He was presented as precisely the kind of loyal constituent long-term incumbents assume will remain loyal forever. What did 25 years of loyalty get me? Became the emotional blade, because it reframed the entire San Francisco argument around a man who had followed the rules, built something, paid into the system, supported his representative, and still ended up packing his livelihood into boxes. Trump set that story beside Pelosi's properties and asked the audience to compare who had flourished during those decades and who had been forced to leave. The Napa vineyard became another weapon in that contrast, with Trump mocking the distance between wine country wealth and streets poisoned by fentanyl, a line intentionally harsh because the script wanted every symbol of Pelosi's private success to collide with every symbol of public failure. The Washington waterfront condo became another contrast, clean and valuable against the fear and disorder he attributed to parts of her own district, while the commercial real estate portfolio reinforced the broader question of how public service and private prosperity had expanded together so dramatically. Pelosi could answer that she had secured billions in federal investment for San Francisco, and in the source she did exactly that, pointing to housing, infrastructure, transit, healthcare, and the sheer volume of money she had helped direct toward the city. Trump did not dispute that the funding existed. Instead, he weaponized the outcome, arguing that if billions had arrived while homelessness worsened, overdoses climbed, crime remained a major political issue, and businesses continued leaving, then the existence of spending could not by itself be treated as evidence of success. His question became brutally simple again. If the money came, where did the improvement go? That was the trap built into the structure of the debate, because every traditional Pelosi defense was immediately converted into another prosecution exhibit, and experience became responsibility, spending became a demand for results, wealth became a contrast with public decay, and reform became an admission that the problem had become too visible to ignore. Pelosi answered in the language of federal investment and legislative accomplishment. But Trump kept dragging the discussion back to conditions ordinary people could see without reading a congressional report. The tents, the drugs, the closed businesses, the fear, the empty storefronts, and the constituents who had given up. He repeated the essential imbalance without needing to repeat every statistic. The city received money, Pelosi accumulated power, the Pelosi household accumulated extraordinary wealth, yet the problem central to the argument did not disappear, and in several categories described in the script became worse. At some point, he argued, 37 years stops being a shield and becomes ownership because a politician cannot campaign on decades of experience while behaving as though decades of outcomes belong entirely to somebody else. Pelosi reached toward the water again, paused with her hand on the glass, and for the first time, the carefully controlled rhythm of her movements looked less like command and more like someone buying a second before the next blow arrived. Trump delivered the line quietly. If this was what 37 years of Nancy Pelosi looked like, no wonder she was retiring. Then he placed the Sharpie down and closed the folder for the first time that evening. The physical change mattered inside the script because until that moment, every section had been driven by paper, timelines, disclosures, property listings, statistics, photographs, and letters. But now, Trump stepped away from the podium as if the evidence phase had ended and the character argument was about to begin. He addressed her simply as Nancy, stripping away representative, stripping away speaker, and turning a confrontation between political offices into something deliberately personal. Then he went back to February 4th, 2020, the State of the Union address, where Pelosi sat behind him as Speaker of the House and, at the end of the speech, tore up the printed pages in full view of the cameras. What Trump was about to argue was that those torn pages contained more than his words, and that the act Pelosi had treated as political theater had also torn through the names and stories of Americans who had nothing to do with the hatred between the two people standing on that stage. Trump's next move was designed to strip the State of the Union moment of its partisan packaging and force Pelosi to confront what had actually been printed on the pages she tore apart behind him. He reminded the room that the speech had included the story of Sergeant First Class Townsend Williams returning home to surprise his wife and children, a military family reunited in the gallery while the chamber stood and applauded, and he treated that moment not as Republican theater, but as a human story that had been physically sitting inside the document Pelosi ripped on camera. He then invoked Janiah Davis, the fourth grader from Philadelphia, whose mother could not afford the school she wanted and whose scholarship had been announced during the address, again forcing the audience to separate the people mentioned in the speech from the president who had delivered it. The argument was viciously simple. Pelosi had defended the tearing by describing the address as a manifesto of mistruths. But Trump now demanded to know whether the soldier's homecoming was a mistruth, whether the child's scholarship was a mistruth, and whether the families sitting in that gallery deserved to have their stories folded into a performance meant to humiliate him. He did not accuse her of merely disagreeing with a speech. He accused her of turning every person inside that speech into collateral damage for the sake of a camera shot. That was the distinction he kept hammering, because Pelosi could have discarded the pages after their broadcast, criticized the address in a press conference, issued a statement, gone on television, or spent the next week attacking every claim Trump had made, but instead she ripped the document directly behind him where every camera in the chamber could capture it. In the script's framing, that choice mattered because it turned objection into spectacle and made the gesture itself more memorable than whatever argument Pelosi intended it to represent. Trump treated the scene as evidence of a larger pattern in which institutional moments became tools for personal political combat, and he accused Pelosi of always knowing exactly where the camera was, exactly what image would dominate the next news cycle, and exactly how to turn outrage into a performance. The attack was not really about paper anymore. It was about motive, and Trump's claim was that Pelosi did not simply oppose him, but repeatedly used the symbols of government as props inside battles she wanted the public to watch. Then he pivoted without warning to the issue he said was worse than the ripped speech, a betrayal that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with someone Pelosi had called a friend for half a century. Joe Biden became the center of the next section, and Trump slowed the cadence because the accusation no longer depended on stock charts, surveillance footage, property listings, or city statistics, but on loyalty. He described Biden as Pelosi's friend and political ally of roughly 50 years, someone who had worked beside her across decades of legislation, elections, funerals, celebrations, and the endless private rituals that bind Washington relationships long after individual policy fights disappear. Then came the collapse after Biden's disastrous debate performance, the falling poll numbers, the panic inside the Democratic Party, and Trump's allegation that Pelosi began calling donors, caucus leaders, Chuck Schumer, and Hakeem Jeffries as pressure mounted on Biden to abandon his re-election campaign. The script framed those calls as the construction of a political wall around the sitting president, not a wall built to protect him, but one designed to leave him with fewer and fewer exits until withdrawal became inevitable. Trump's point was brutal precisely because it attacked the language of friendship with the mechanics of power. When Biden could still win, he was an ally. When he became a liability, the relationship supposedly became expendable. He reminded Pelosi that she later said publicly she had not called anyone to pressure Biden, then contrasted that denial with subsequent interviews in which she acknowledged doing what she believed needed to be done and discussed how an earlier withdrawal might have opened the door to a more competitive primary process. The script used those statements to frame her public denials as carefully constructed technical language, the kind of Washington phrasing that can survive a television interview while still leaving enough room for an entirely different private reality. Trump then pulled Jill Biden into the argument, citing the First Lady's remark that she and Pelosi were friends for 50 years, with the past tense carrying more damage than a page of angry accusations ever could. He seized on that single word, were, because it suggested that the political operation around Biden's withdrawal had not merely damaged a campaign strategy, but shattered a relationship that had survived half a century of Washington turbulence. In Trump's telling, this was not merely party leadership making a hard electoral calculation, it was Pelosi demonstrating that even loyalty had an expiration date once the numbers on the polling screen became inconvenient. The attack then widened again, pulling together impeachment, January 6th institutional rhetoric, and Pelosi's repeated claim that she had spent her career defending democracy, protecting institutions, and safeguarding the republic from Trump. Trump responded by accusing her of using those institutions rather than protecting them, turning the speaker's gavel, congressional procedure, impeachment power, party discipline, and public crises into instruments that could be deployed whenever the political objective demanded it. He tied the stock trading accusations to family enrichment, the salon controversy to selective rule following, San Francisco to decades of political ownership without equivalent accountability, and Biden to a relationship discarded when electoral usefulness collapsed. Then came the line built to condense every previous section into a character judgment. Pelosi did not have friends, she had chess pieces, and when a piece could no longer help her win, she removed it from the board. It was a deliberately merciless conclusion because it transformed every controversy from an isolated incident into evidence for one alleged governing instinct, the instinct to treat people, institutions, rules, and alliances according to their strategic value. The room went still in the script, the kind of silence that does not arrive because an audience has lost interest, but because everyone is waiting to see whether the target can produce an answer powerful enough to break the frame that has just been built around her. Jake Tapper finally turned to Pelosi and gave her 2 minutes to respond, an enormous amount of time in television terms after an extended attack involving money, stock trades, lockdowns, San Francisco, Biden, impeachment, and 4 decades of political power. Pelosi opened her mouth, closed it, and stood behind the podium with her hands resting flat, without reaching again for the water, without adjusting her glasses, without summoning the familiar gestures that had accompanied thousands of public appearances. 3 seconds passed, then 5, and the script treated every second as a political eternity, because Nancy Pelosi had spent 40 years making sure silence was almost never part of her public vocabulary. When she finally spoke, she said she had served the country for 37 years and did not need to defend her record to anyone. Trump did not shout over her and did not need to, because he answered by accepting the premise and then twisting it directly back toward the camera. She was right, he said. She did not need to defend the record to him. She needed to defend it to the people watching, because they were the people who had paid for it. The script then returned to the image from the opening, those 9 seconds of Pelosi behind the podium, without the practiced counterattack, without the smile, without the verbal maneuver that had rescued her from 1,000 hostile exchanges before. For a political figure who had survived Newt Gingrich, George W. Bush, the Tea Party, Trump's first term, 2 impeachments, the attack on her husband, and the collapse of Biden's re-election campaign, the absence of an immediate answer was presented as more damaging than any insult Trump had delivered all night. The entire confrontation had been designed to reach exactly that image. Decades of political command reduced to a pause long enough for millions of viewers to project their own verdict into the empty space. According to the script, the silence went viral before the broadcast had even finished, with clips of the moment spreading across social media and the stock trading timelines becoming screenshots, memes, and shorthand for the entire confrontation. The phrase about chess pieces and friends began circulating alongside clips of Pelosi reaching for her water glass, while the 3 stock trade timelines were stripped from the broader debate and reposted as compact visual accusations that could travel without any of the surrounding context. The internet did what it always does with moments like this: slowed them down, replayed them, added music, captions, edits, jokes, and cruelty, turning a few seconds of television into a permanent digital artifact impossible for any communications team to pull back. Pelosi's office responded the following morning with a statement emphasizing her legislative record, attacking Trump's motives and criminal record, and stating that Paul Pelosi's trades were legal, publicly disclosed, and independently conducted. But in the script's framing, the statement was notable less for what it said than for what it did not directly answer, because the Nvidia timeline, the Visa timeline, the Google timeline, the enormous wealth gap, Erica Cuse, David Chen, and the Biden relationship all remained sitting there exactly where Trump had left them. The statement arrived early on a Saturday, which the script mocked as the Washington equivalent of trying to bury a political body before the weekend had properly started. Yet, the controversy did not disappear with the news cycle, because the next stage was presented not as another shouting match, but as institutional movement around the very issue Trump had spent the first part of the debate attacking. A congressional stock trading ban that had been stalled suddenly gained new attention, with additional senators signing on and the proposal moving closer toward a floor fight. Pelosi herself had already endorsed restrictions by that point, but inside the script, that endorsement was now reframed in the harshest possible way, less like reform born from principle and more like a fire door installed after the smoke was already pouring through the hallway. And as the political machinery started turning, the 9 seconds that had begun, the entire story stopped being merely a viral clip and became the symbol the script would use to frame everything that came next. The political fallout in the script's telling did not stop with viral clips, Saturday statements, or another cycle of cable news outrage, because the stock trading question had moved from spectacle into the machinery of Washington. Senator Josh Hawley's congressional stock trading proposal, described as stalled for months, suddenly gained momentum as previously uncommitted senators added their names, and the issue moved closer to a floor vote, turning what had been treated as another ethics talking point into a direct test of whether lawmakers were willing to impose restrictions on themselves. Pelosi's earlier support for a ban was now viewed through a different lens, because after the timelines had been placed under a national spotlight, reform no longer looked purely proactive. In the script's merciless framing, it looked like someone closing the vault after the money had already been counted. The Government Accountability Office was described as beginning a formal review of congressional trading patterns, with Pelosi-related disclosures cited as examples of the broader issue under examination, while the Securities and Exchange Commission was said to have opened a preliminary inquiry rather than a formal investigation. None of that by itself proved the central accusation Trump had spent the debate implying, but politically, it did something almost as damaging. It kept the question alive after the cameras were supposed to move on. CNN's post-debate analysis, as presented in the source, tried to separate what could be documented from what remained allegation, with Jake Tapper emphasizing that the trade dates and public filings were real while the claim of inside knowledge had not been proven. That distinction should have offered Pelosi breathing room, but the script immediately turned even that caution against her by focusing on Tapper's observation that she had not directly answered the question sitting at the center of the exchange. Fox News replayed the 9 seconds repeatedly. Conservative outlets pulled apart every trade and every committee timeline they could connect to a Pelosi disclosure, and Pelosi Tracker was said to experience a massive surge in interest as viewers rushed to follow the very trading activity that had become the controversy. The irony was brutal. The more critics argued that congressional trading looked suspicious, the more Americans wanted tools that let them watch lawmakers trade, and the more people watched, the harder it became for elected officials to insist the subject was merely partisan noise. What had once been buried inside dense financial disclosure forms had become content, and content moves faster than congressional explanations ever will. Progressive media, according to the script, fractured rather than closing ranks, with some voices urging a broader stock trading ban and stronger transparency rules instead of simply defending Pelosi against Trump. The New York Times editorial board was described as pushing the principle that transparency could not be optional, while a left-leaning economics podcast examined the statistical improbability of the trade timing and presented its own much longer odds against coincidence. Those analyses still did not transform correlation into proof, but that was never the political standard Trump had been exploiting. His standard was whether the pattern looked disturbing enough that ordinary viewers would stop accepting polished denials as the end of the discussion. The debate had changed the emotional burden of proof, even where the legal burden remained untouched, because once viewers were staring at repeated dates, arrows, transactions, and government actions, every future Pelosi trade could be interpreted through the same frame. That was the damage. Not a verdict, not a conviction, but a suspicion powerful enough to survive every carefully worded statement designed to contain it. The Biden fallout moved differently, quieter than the trading controversy, but far more personal, because it reopened a wound that had never fully healed after the collapse of his re-election campaign. Former Biden aides, speaking anonymously in the script, described a president learning that Pelosi had been calling donors and party figures while pressure mounted for him to leave the race, and one account presented Biden sitting in silence before saying that Pelosi had promised him she would not do this. Whether every private detail could be independently confirmed was beside the point inside the narrative, because the story had already attached itself to Jill Biden's cold description of a friendship that existed in the past tense. When reporters later asked Jill Biden about the debate, the source says she offered only that she had nothing to add, a refusal so restrained that it sounded more cutting than a public feud. 50 years of friendship had been reduced to distance, and Trump's chess pieces line now hung over every new report about the rupture. Pelosi's planned retirement, framed as a dignified conclusion to a historic career, was then reinterpreted by her critics as something closer to an escape hatch, another example of timing being dragged into the court of public suspicion. A Republican lawmaker in the source crudely summarized the new narrative by suggesting she was leaving before the audit, the kind of line that spreads not because it proves anything, but because it captures the mood of people already convinced the system protects those who know how to use it. In San Francisco, the succession fight intensified, and the script claimed that leading Democratic contenders avoided centering Pelosi in their campaign messaging, did not chase her endorsement, and did not treat Pacific Heights as the mandatory political pilgrimage it once had been. The mansion that had symbolized decades of Democratic power was suddenly described as quiet, its gates less like the entrance to a political command center and more like the walls around a legacy under review. Power had not vanished, but the aura of inevitability had cracked, and in politics, that can be the beginning of something far more permanent than a bad week of headlines. Then the script returned to David Chen, because after all the numbers, investigations, television analysis, and party warfare, the story wanted to end where political arguments are supposed to end, with the people who had to live inside the consequences. Chen was described sitting in a small Oakland apartment above a dry cleaner, watching Trump read his letter on a tablet while the tools from his closed hardware store remained packed in a cardboard box nearby. 25 years of work had been reduced to wrenches, testers, chalk, an old canvas apron, and the smell of sawdust trapped inside things he had not been able to bring himself to unpack. When the clip reached Pelosi's silence, Chen did not celebrate wildly or treat it like a sporting event. According to the source, he simply nodded and said that after 37 years, she had not been able to keep his street safe. That line mattered more than the memes because it stripped the entire debate of its entertainment value and turned it back into the basic accusation Trump had been building from the beginning. What did decades of loyalty actually buy the people who kept returning the same politician to power? Chen eventually walked to the box, peeled away the tape, and lifted the old canvas apron that had once belonged to his working life, the physical remains of a business that had survived long enough to become part of his identity before repeated losses finally broke it. A framed photograph of his father standing outside the original hardware store remained nearby, preserving a version of San Francisco in which the business was open. The future looked stable, and political loyalty still felt like an investment rather than a habit. The script lets that image sit against everything that came before it: Pelosi's homes, the vineyard, the stock gains, the congressional titles, the power, the federal funding, and the enormous distance between elite success and the small business owner trying to decide whether he can begin again somewhere else. Maybe Oakland needed a hardware store, Chen thought, and the line carried a kind of restrained defiance because, after all the institutions had failed him in the story, survival still required him to be the one who rebuilt. Washington could hold hearings, commissions could publish reports, politicians could issue statements, but David Chen still had to open the box himself. The final argument returned to the phrase that had defined the entire confrontation: show us the math. The script recapped the $250 million fortune, the congressional salary, Paul Pelosi's trades, the legislative timelines, the lockdown rules, the salon controversy, the deterioration Trump attributed to San Francisco, the Biden rupture, and the 9 seconds of silence, presenting them not as disconnected controversies, but as one long indictment of power without equivalent accountability. Trump's case, as the source framed it, was that Pelosi had accumulated influence, wealth, loyalty, and institutional control for decades, while the people paying for government were expected to accept explanations that became thinner every time the dates were placed beside one another. Pelosi had spent 40 years mastering the mechanics of Washington, but in this confrontation, the weapon was not procedure, seniority, or a gavel. It was the ability to place public information in a sequence simple enough for everyone watching to understand. She had the title, he had the receipts, and for 9 seconds, the receipts were louder. The call to action then hit with the same aggressive rhythm as the original, urging viewers to like, subscribe, share, comment on the moment that landed hardest, and keep watching as the reviews, proposed reforms, and political consequences continued. It praised small business owners who followed rules while believing rulemakers did not. Taxpayers who wanted to know how public officials became extraordinarily wealthy, and ordinary Americans who had sacrificed during the lockdowns while watching political elites move through a different reality. The script closed by reducing the entire spectacle to its ugliest contrast. Pelosi had spent a lifetime building power, while Trump spent one evening forcing that power to stand beside numbers it could not easily explain away. One figure arrived with decades of institutional authority behind her, the other with a folder, a marker, and a strategy built around dates, disclosures, and repetition. And the image that survived everything else was still the same image from the beginning: Nancy Pelosi behind a podium, staring forward while 9 seconds stretched long enough to become the verdict the script wanted the audience to remember.